Our next presentation is contributed to us gratefully by the eminent art historian Joseph Leo Koerner. He is professor of the history of art and architecture at the prestigious Harvard University. His books include The Reformation of the Image and the next book, Caspar David Friedrich as a Subject of Landscape, and his other book, Bosch and Bruegel, From Enemy Painting to Everyday Life. And he was already part of a ZKM exhibition, which was called Iconoclash, Beyond the Image Wars in Science, Religion and Art. This was an exhibition from 2002. And he curated the section, The Icon as Iconoclasm. In 2018, he made a feature film documentary, The Burning Child. In the center of the presentation of Leo Koerner stands a sentence by Novalis, the central poet of the Romantic movement. Novalis asks, where are we going? Home, all the time. That means wherever we go, our aim is home. That means the Romantics started with the land, with the territory, with the soil, what we classify generally as home. So Romantic painting is in fact the knowledge about the territory we stand. We call it landscape. But Koerner shows us that this landscape painting is already a model, avant la lettre, of what we call today critical zones. Because Romantic painters already showed the stratosphere of atmosphere, the clouds, the weather, dramatic changes in the clouds and the weather. Then came the biosphere, the land, but included in the biosphere is already the subterranean world, the zone underneath the surface of the earth. They've been interested in caves and animals, etc., etc. Then comes even the hydrosphere. So we have the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, sea paintings, sea and water. The famous Romantic paintings about the sea by Caspar David Friedrich. And then they show how these three spheres are connected. For example, you see the clouds, then you see the water, then you see the mist of the water, back to the clouds, and the rain and water drops again, etc. So we see precisely what Alexander von Humboldt said. Nature is a dynamic process of interaction where everything is connected to everything. It's an interaction between everything and everything. So they had a circular homeostatic image of nature, which was not known until today. And Koerner shows precisely that landscape painting from Romantics predated our model of the skin of the earth. He also shows that landscape painting is influenced by sea painting. So the interest how you structure and shape the dynamic movements of the sea is also later formally visible in landscape painting. Alexander von Humboldt shows his symbiotic idea of nature, which was also avant la lettre a kind of idea of a symbiotic planet, like the book title of Lynn Margulis. He showed precisely a network where everything was connected to everything. His famous book is called The Cosmos, but originally he wanted to call it the Book of Nature, after the title of Albertus Magnus. So, Koerner shows us the stratification in landscape painting and the history of Romantic landscape painting. And that shows precisely that you can see the landscape painters of Romantic movement as brothers in mind and heart towards an earthly politics. Therefore the title, Earth Tidings.
The advent of the Anthropocene has forced us radically to rethink the relation between nature and the human. We had only recently gotten used to deep time, the eons of geological and cosmic time. In the Bible, human history starts literally just days after the world's creation, And that puts us always already on Earth with natural history and our history, keeping time with one another. But then the geological record, combined, of course, with new ways of reading that record, showed a completely different time frame, one that was out of balance, measured not in generations, centuries, or millennia, but in thousands of millions of years. This is a painting by the French artist Gustave Courbet, and it shows this old stumbling stone for human thought, what it really looks like, this new idea of time, deep time, painted in the 1860s. It tries to capture what one might call the ancestral perspective, time before there was human time. Courbet creates these big rocks where you can read in them in the sedimental layers the time that went into their creation. These rocks, in some sense, measure time, but Courbet paints these rocks not so that you are comfortable reading them like a scientist might a graph. He paints them in such a way that they seem alien, they seem like some brute other force. And it's because of the way that Courbet has chosen to paint. He's not carefully detailing the sediments in a descriptive way, but rather he's laying on browns and grays and whites with a palette knife, so that the canvas and the paint on the canvas becomes rock-like and therefore becomes unamenable to an easy reading as made by and for the human. Of course, there are stories in the picture. The sporting male and female deer there give a sense of a narrative about generation and regeneration, of kind of biological beginnings in the form of the male and female, and in the background, that dark cavern is part of a symbolism in Courbet of the maternal, of the biological origins from which we come. And that in itself anthropomorphizes the landscape because it projects Courbet's symbolism onto the scene. But what Courbet really wants is to introduce us into a world that doesn't really contain us, that's different from us. In short, this was the time we just got used to, the time of deep time. And then all of a sudden, we have to picture and actively respond to the fact that the human has changed that flow of deep time. And that the human has changed the flow of deep time, not just with the speed of eons or even at the pace of biblical history or in the space of centuries, but in the space of decades. This rapidity, geological time running suddenly in sync, not just with human history, but with lifetime. This rapidity, of course, spells disaster for human life. It's a change in time frames that's harder to picture, perhaps, than the earlier one of deep time, because it's more dreadful. It's a little like that old reversal that the existentialists love, writers like Sartre, that say you're in a park and you're looking at everything in the park unobserved, and you feel yourself to be the sovereign subject of the view. And then suddenly you see in the distance, or perhaps actually close by you, in nearby, or perhaps behind you, behind your back, when you turn, you see that someone is looking at you. Indeed, someone has been looking at you the whole time. It turns everything inside out, like a glove too hastily removed. Painters are great at dramatizing and instantiating that kind of perspectival reversal. After all, they can cause the things that they make, the inert bits of wood and canvas covered by pigments, makes them look alive, makes them even to the point of looking out at us before we can look out at them, so that we're not the beholder, we're being beheld. One problem with our ability to think the Anthropocene is that to have thought deep time, to have thought the eons of geological time, we had to disentangle ourselves from the natural world. Or to put this another way, we had to imagine, to create, as it were, an image or a picture of a rift or a bifurcation in nature between things out there as they are in themselves, outside of us, and how we perceive them, our perception of things, between primary qualities, one might say, of the thing and secondary qualities of the thing that have to do with how the thing is mediated to us by light and by sound and by the mechanics of perception. That kind of split was important to the scientific understanding of the world and was important for us to come to grips with deep time. But now earth science tells us that we are deeply enmeshed with what's out there, or worse still, there isn't an out there at all. The natural world invades us microbially. This is a painting by a rather obscure but a remarkable Flemish painter working in the early 17th century, conveniently at the beginning of the scientific revolution. It shows Saint Anthony, the patron saint of the monastic order in Christianity, surrounded by demons as he goes about his devotion. And of all the demons, perhaps the most monstrous and terrifying is that gigantic face that looks over at him, partly over at us, out of the picture, out into the picture. And we know that that face is actually a self-portrait of the artist who shows himself invaded by the very monstrosities he is conjuring. The sense which makes the picture for me a great avatar of critical zones, the sense of being invaded by the world and the world also being out of sync. It's partly out of sync because of that bad atmosphere in the distance, that murky world of sea and sky in which the demons are coming to invade this earth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm letting these things, these paintings, these bits of paint-covered wood or canvas speak as a sort of avatar, a visual avatar for critical zones. Why paintings, you might say? Why this painting? For me, the central one in my own contribution to the exhibition, my own way of thinking through critical zones, a landscape by the quintessential romantic painter, Caspar David Friedrich. Like the Frenchman Gustave Courbet, and like the Flemish painting of St. Anthony, this picture hangs in the Kunsthalle in Karlsruhe. And like those paintings, it is poised to come to the ZKM on loan, if the pandemic permits the real rather than virtual opening of critical zones. Now, one of the central concerns of the Romantics, I would say it's their overriding concern, was the sense of a gulf, of a separation or of a bifurcation between the self and nature, between the self and the world. And Friedrich paints this gulf in his picture. We come to the end of the world, as it were. We come to the edge of the inhabited space, this shore scene, and we are given this view of the world of the ocean opening up before us. In fact, looking more closely at it, we can see we haven't even come to the end. It's a representation of coming to the end of the earth, which is itself a never arriving at that end. You'll notice how small that little tree is in the distance. Very hard for us to understand how long it will take us to get to that tree. Beyond the tree, there's a cliff. And we begin to measure that cliff, and we see the cliffs in the gulf there around that bay. We see that the cliffs might be hundreds, maybe many hundreds of feet high before we reach the water. So there's already a gulf before we get to the gulf, and then comes the gulf, and then comes the water, and then comes this rising reef of rock, which is the dramatic subject of the picture. It's a remarkable image because it's an erratic, almost unpicturesque, hard to picture representation of the natural world as other, because you can't get to it, you can't land on such a reef, you can't cross over to such a reef, and other because it doesn't fit into something that might be a picture, because it's so unamenable to the beauty ideals of what painting can do. And so it's formally other, it's narrative, it's other in terms of a narrative, and it gives a story about the rift between the self and the world, the viewer and the object, in this dramatic way. One of the features of it, though, that is important for thinking through how Romanticism both pictures the gulf between the world and the self, but also imagines a way of recuperating some kind of unity, if only as a kind of nostalgic goal, is the fact that the entire scene is bathed in a moonlight. It's the quintessential romantic setting, what Eichendorff and others called the mondbeglänzte Zaubernacht, the mondbeglänzte Zaubernacht, the moonlit magic landscape. And this was romantic in one sense because it was everything that the Romantics liked, kind of mystery and a kind of sense of the Gothic and the irrational. But it was also a philosophical condition because the moonlit landscape at night was a landscape in which everything one saw because of reflected light. Not the light of the sun, but the light shining on the moon and reflected to the world. And therefore, it evoked a world that was self-reflexive, a world that was enclosed to itself, thinking about itself. And therefore, it was a world that mirrored the self-reflexive nature of the human subject looking out at the world. So one had a sense of two subjectivities, one enclosed in itself, tragically, nostalgically trying to get out, and then the world itself being like that. And the two worlds meld, and therefore it's a dream of the coming together, what one might call a return to Earth. The Romantics gave a name to this return to Earth. They called it, the dream they called Erdkunde. According to this dream, Earth gives tidings of where we are. It gives these locally. Each place expresses itself in the strata of its development and time. Romantic science and art worked to perceive those tidings. Knowing where we are, you might say, we discover who we are. So our place, our home, isn't an accident anymore. It's an origin. Romantic painting is Erdkunde, earth tidings. Though these paintings come to us from the historical past, the paintings, this one from 200 years ago, they help us envision future forms of earthly belonging and homemaking on Earth in the new stratum, the new developing stratum, the Anthropocene. Personally, I find it meaningful that the works we want to bring to critical zones have their home in Karlsruhe. All the works are from the Kunsthalle, a neighboring institution, and it's a local collaboration, a wonderful way of moving works from one place to the other, but in the same locality. We'll see the works differently when they're no longer in the Kunsthalle and they're now placed in the critical zones. And perhaps when they return to the Kunsthalle, they will return changed. But I like this idea, this fact that the works that we're seeing are based in Karlsruhe. They're part of Karlsruhe's patrimony and therefore related to the place. And it's a good way to be at home with these works by these works being at home where they're shown. Now, in making my selection of the paintings, of which ones to show in Critical Zone, I was guided by a particular painting or picture. Actually, it calls itself a painting, this one here, Alexander von Humboldt's famous Naturgemälde. It is actually the portrayal of the critical zone, that little pellicule of inhabitable terrain between the world down here of the underwater world and also the subterranean world, still filled with life, as Humboldt knows, in terms of a biome that contains life even below the surface, and then the surface of the earth, and then rising up to the top where it's where the atmosphere is thin and then becomes unbreathable. And so it's a cross-section of the critical zone, showing the way in which vegetation as the primary form of life is distributed in the critical zone from under the soil all the way up to the snowy, oxygen-deprived highlands. But it shows this as a landscape. It shows this as a kind of aesthetic construct, the critical zone. The aesthetic was crucial to Alexander Humboldt. On the one hand, he's known as the father of ecology, of a sense of how everything is interconnected. And the picture shows that interconnectivity between vegetation and place, and between different forms of vegetation as they all form a kind of systemic whole. But it was very important to him that this interconnected character of the natural world be expressed through an aesthetic creation, which is here landscape, an art form, a painting, what he called a Naturgemälde, a nature painting. Elsewhere, Humboldt speaks about his experiences and his researches of nature always in terms of the aesthetic act of beholding and comprehending the world through words like views of the natural world, views of the Andes, Ansichten der Natur. The idea that the scientific subject who researches and finds all the facts has to be melded to an experiencing subject, and therefore through the expression, through an aesthetic expression like landscape. And indeed, in his masterpiece Cosmos, Alexander von Humboldt goes in a detour from the experience he has of the whole of nature, which came to him when he climbed up that volcano that we see here in South America and saw the interconnectedness of the whole world himself as one of his experiences. He links that aha experience to how he's going to represent it in the book Cosmos, and that requires him to make a detour through the history of landscape painting. And so Alexander Humboldt was not just a model for the critical zone, it was also a model for the way in which to understand the critical zone. One needed perhaps to look at the history of the representation of that zone in the form of landscape painting. And it was a wonderful discovery that in the Kunsthalle there was such a rich archive of representations of the critical zone, including this remarkable painting by a lesser-known Swiss artist by the name of Caspar Wolff. Caspar Wolff was an artist who started off as a decorative artist doing kind of Rococo designs, but he eventually specialized in representing alpine views. The Alps had never been really the center of artistic representation before Caspar Wolff. There had been Bruegel, who crossed the Alps and painted amazing alpine views, but these would be integrated into worldscapes. Here, Caspar Wolff was going into the Alps. He actually did studies of these different parts, the different places on the Alps. Here, the Simmental with the Siebenbrunnen, these seven little springs pouring forth into the world. And he made these pictures for illustrations of the Alps as well as for tourists who came to the Alps now for a new kind of sublime. People used to travel to Rome and Florence to see the human sublime, the sublime of ancient history and of the Renaissance art. But now people were looking at the natural world of the Alps as a new form of sublimity, and Caspar Wolff's pictures could be brought home as souvenirs. But it's not just a picture of the Alps. It has a kind of, let's say, heuristic dimension. It explains something about the natural world in the way that the sky with its clouds might be said to be giving rise to precipitation, which forms in a primordial way, secreted in the form of the glacier forms that are up on the high hill. And then the glacier we read and we understand by looking at the picture, and its logic by working through the picture must be melting through subterranean tunnels, then to pour forth as fructifying water, which gives birth to the beginnings of vegetation, a kind of premonition of the Humboldtian Naturgemälde. But already in 1770, when Humboldt was just born, the Romantics, working then generation or two after Humboldt, after Caspar Wolff, will give a name to this kind of painting. There's no name in Wolff's vocabulary, but the Romantics in the orbit of Caspar David Friedrich would call such a work a Erdlebensbild, an earth life painting. or Erdlebensbild, Erdlebengemälde, a portrait of the life of the earth, because it not only shows the earth, it shows how the earth functions as a system, and it shows that the earth is a living thing, and that means that we are included in it. And it gave me a kind of signal of how one might organize the pictures that we are going to look at and borrow, hopefully, from the Kunsthalle, starting with atmosphere, with landing on Earth by coming from the atmosphere, and beginning with this remarkable painting by the Danish artist, but closely associated with Caspar David Friedrich. He visited Friedrich in his studio in Dresden. Friedrich himself had been a student in Copenhagen, and therefore had a kinship with Dahl, who was born actually in Norway but trained in Denmark. And here is Johann Christian Clausen Dahl doing one of these remarkable studies of clouds. At the same time as he's doing these cloud studies done from life, looking at the clouds at the moment in which they are this formation. In England, John Constable is also doing cloud studies. So it was a period fascination with clouds, with trying to get them right, with getting right the atmosphere, and getting right the atmosphere quasi in scientific terms. Clouds are remarkable things to try and represent. You can't draw them very easily because they are an outline. They're more a form that's most amenable, in fact, to be painted, to be depicted in the medium of painting, which isn't about outline, which is about big surfaces. So being a cloud painter is learning how to paint, and learning how to paint means learning how to paint clouds. So there's this reciprocity. And there's a beautiful version with this very, very thin arena of earth below, and then the rest of the little picture given over to this remarkable representation of atmosphere. Atmosphere. Actually, the word atmosphere, which comes from the Greek, is a coinage of the Dutch experts on atmosphere. It was a translation from the Latin of how to describe this new immensity that scientists were grappling with, and the Dutch scientists of the 17th century coined the term atmosphere as a translation actually from a Dutch word which meant a kind of clot of vapor, the dampkloot. So atmosphere as a word and atmosphere as the object of study was a very Dutch formation, and it's not surprising that the Dutch were the first real explorers pictorially of atmosphere. It's quite a remarkable transformation that Dutch painting made when it lowered the horizon of the traditional landscapes before them, lowered the horizon. It turned what was a world of intricate representations of the natural world of trees and vistas into something that was almost unremarkable. The landscapes of these early periods in Dutch landscape painting are raised just little bits of soil and swamp and dune up above the eye level here, and then it leaves the entire picture to be filled by sky and by clouds. And here, in this picture in the Karlsruhe Kunsthalle, by something quite remarkable, the burning smoke of a lime kiln, a kind of premonition of the interaction between the human and the natural in the world of atmosphere as being already toxic, as being already worrying about what it is that constitutes the atmosphere. The Romantics and post-Romantic painting specialized in the representation of sky and the transformations of atmosphere. Here, another beautiful picture in the Karlsruhe Kunsthalle of some kind of approaching storm. Then in the 19th century, in the art of John Ruskin, there was an observation that the clouds, first of all, had to be understood, You couldn't just imagine clouds, you have to look at clouds, but when understanding the clouds became a science and an art, people like John Ruskin discovered that the clouds were changing, that there was a storm cloud, as he put it, of the 19th century, which was the storm cloud of pollution. So there's this interesting relationship between landscape painting, the representation of atmosphere, beginning already with the Dutch, developing in the Romantic period, and then the realization that atmosphere was changing. Atmosphere is something that brings out pictorial energies, like in this wonderful painting by Franz Marc, in which the mists, as they fill up the trees on this mountain slope, are given a kind of experimental and yet finally convincing, compelling expression in the relationship between grays and greens, in the relationship between what has been painted first and what has been painted afterwards. The ability to work quickly and to work in a consciousness of process of painting in order to capture the process character of atmosphere, the way atmosphere here invades the trees in the same way as the grays have to invade the painted trees, and yet the painted trees have to give way to the atmosphere. Here, another much larger picture of that pellicule of the breathable world, the world we live in, the endangered one, but in a painting by a later Romantic artist, Carl Friedrich Lessing. And I show this picture because it also allows us to enter another dimension in the paintings we're going to look at, which is, as you can see, we're poised above a ravine, a deep ravine here. Here's a wanderer in the typical Romantic moment. He's looking out with us into the natural world. There's a symbolism here of redemption, all those ways of trying to imagine, well, what does it all mean? What does landscape mean? Is it about redemption? Is it about, is that yearning that we have for the world out there somehow related to some final reckoning? All these questions are baked into the picture. But what I'm most interested in here is that the picture shows the world of the great horizon, the world of the atmosphere above, but it also plunges down into something invisible, but something very important to the Romantics. And here you see Caspar David Friedrich in a very early drawing, a sketch, which he dates there. We know exactly when it was drawn, or in July of 1800. It shows a wanderer, probably the person he was with, looking into a deep hole, what's called the Schinderloch, probably a place where people threw the carcasses of dead animals, maybe during times in which animals were stricken by plague. So it has something, in fact, to do with hygiene, but nonetheless deeper than that, both in terms of meaning and in terms of actual size, is the depth that is augured, is suggested by looking into one of these cavernous openings in the earth. The Romantics and Friedrich quintessentially had a sense that the earth had under its surface immensities that were the perfect symmetry to the immensities of heaven above. And interestingly, they also imagined that the immensity of the interior of the earth shone through in caves and caverns and chasms and crevices like this, only in a tiny way, that internal world was a little bit like the world inside of us. In fact, some of the Romantic scientists tried to draw a relationship between the cavities, the inner cavities of the skull, and the inner cavities of the earth. So there was this sense of the subterranean, which was crucial to the Romantics. And it has to do with, how do we understand Earth? How do we understand the Earth as being a kind of living force? Here, a large and dramatic picture of a volcano by this artist Schmidt, also in the Kunsthalle, with these figures dwarfed by the explosion of the subterranean. But there are calmer representations of the same sense of the verticality of the earth. This beautiful painting by an artist who's very represented in Karlsruhe Kunsthalle, Johann Wilhelm Schirmer, which shows rocks on a coastal location, which show with a kind of forensic detail the sediments and therefore the time scale of this earth that we inhabit. At the same time as Schirmer shows the process of formation and of dissolution by the ways the water is lapping against the shore. So we can enter with this picture from the atmosphere through the lithosphere of the world of the earth and the subterranean in the romantic imagination to the hydrosphere, the world of the ocean, here represented in another picture by Schirmer. But I want to just conclude in terms of what these paintings show with something that, of course, ties them all together. And we saw already in the Courbet that all of these spheres are really one interconnected system, a biosphere, one might say, which is what I think Courbet long ago was getting at with those deer and with the kind of maternal cave that the picture focuses in on, but refuses again to anthropomorphize. It's anthropomorphic only in the sense that it's part of what we belong to. And this biosphere is what I'll leave you with pictures that the Kunsthalle has. One of them, this remarkable picture by a little known Netherlandish master of still life, Otto Marcius von Schreck. He's an artist who specialized, in fact, he invented a form of still life which buries into the underside of forests, and there discovers a teeming world of life and of conflict over life, of snakes attacking lizards, of butterflies attacking snakes, all this world which is also to do with the mysteries of life. It turns out that this same artist was fascinated by how wasps could emerge from the cocoons of butterflies, and he in fact looked very carefully at cocoons and discovered that that the little flies that emerged from dead cocoons weren't in fact spontaneously generated as had been thought. They weren't an example of counter nature, but they were born from eggs and then larvae laid by parasitic wasps. So this guy naturalized what had seemed to be outside of nature and realized how the cocoon works, how the caterpillar becomes the butterfly, and how mysterious, seemingly spontaneously generated forms, fungus, frogs, and so forth, are actually all part of nature. So the idea then of really seeing the interconnected nature of things, and all of a sudden also seeing that everything is natural, that there is no contrary to nature, but it's just that nature is the self-generating system. And I want to conclude then with this sort of avatar again, another avatar of the critical zone, a world in which the self of the artist, Kreisbeck, is invaded by these microbial forms, which are also the forms of his imagination. The inside and the outside are shown to meld here. And one of the many remarkable features of this painting is that he anatomizes the inner self in the most weird way. You can see that his forehead has been peeled open. His Kreisbeck portrait has been peeled open. And what we see inside his brain is a little painter painting a scene. Actually, it's a kind of low-life genre scene of people smoking and drinking inside. It's actually painted from, it's what happens when you paint from life. These were painters who painted low-life genre scenes, and they like to say that they're in tune with the world, they're in tune with human life because they paint it from life. And here in the brain, which is the seat of the imagination, you see the artist painting from life, painting the real. And so the picture wants to meld the relationship between the imagination and the reality, between things out there and things in the self. And it shows also wonderfully the human being drowned in a rising ocean as the waters rise. And it's a premonition, perhaps, at least one way of thinking about it is a premonition of climate change, rising oceans, but much more deeply thinking about what are the resources that the history of painting gives us to imagine the critical zone, to imagine the Anthropocene. And that's what I hope the pictures do. And I invite people to look at them and study them as expressions of a relationship between the human and the natural, which is outside of science, though it's tied up with scientific investigation, and offers, I think, clues, not necessarily to how to escape from our predicament, but how perhaps to picture where we are and therefore to find ourselves somehow landing again on Earth.